Welcome to Cut and Thrust, your podcast for the bloody and sometimes bizarre journey through the Middle Ages. Whether it's dark battles, questionable hygiene, or hair-raising rulers, here you'll get history as it really was, raw and unfiltered. So grab your sword, put on your helmet, and let's dive into the wild world of the past.
Hello and welcome to a new episode of the Battle Merchant podcast. I'm Hendrik.
And I'm Carmen. Today we're covering a topic that truly fascinates me. Children in the Middle Ages.
Between innocence, work and play. That's how you could sum up the lives of little ones back then. And I have to say, right up front, there was no such thing as the one medieval childhood.
The differences were enormous, weren't they?
Absolutely. It depended on so many factors. Origin, the family's social standing, whether you lived in the city or the countryside, and gender naturally played a massive role as well. A child of a wealthy merchant in a Hanseatic city had a completely different life than the child of an unfree peasant somewhere in the countryside.
That's interesting, because today we have this idea of childhood as a protected phase. At least in theory, every child has the same basic rights. But in the Middle Ages, it was tied even more starkly to external circumstances.
And what always fascinates me is the role of the church in all this. They had a, how should I put it, rather contradictory attitude toward children.
Contradictory?
On the one hand, the church admonished people to lead a Christian life, to marry and to have many children. Offspring were considered a blessing, a source of happiness.
That sounds positive at first.
On the other hand, and here's where it gets interesting, the church viewed carnal desires as sin, as temptation. Children were a blessing, yes, but the lust involved was considered problematic.
Wait, so children are God-given, but the desire that creates them is sinful? That's a stark contradiction.
Exactly what makes it so fascinating. Those who chose a pure, God-devoted life back then
entered a monastery
as a monk or nun, and thereby consciously renounced family. That was essentially the ultimate proof of piety.
What a contrast to today. For us, starting a family is seen as something positive, socially desirable. But back then, deliberate childlessness could be the higher path, at least in the eyes of the church.
Although for most people that wasn't a realistic option. Peasants simply needed laborers, and for the nobility, a male heir was
politically vital for survival.
The dynasty had to continue. Without heirs, no continuation of the family, no preservation of property.
And here's where a darker aspect comes in. Child mortality was frighteningly high. Depending on the time and region, 30 to 50% of children died before their 5th birthday, the first year being particularly critical.
That fundamentally shaped family life. You had to plan ahead, essentially, have more children because you knew not all of them would make it.
That's hard for us to imagine. This constant presence of death and loss, even among the very young.
And yet, or perhaps because of it, children held a special status. There was this notion of childlike innocence, but at the same time, children were also seen as needing to be disciplined. Views on this were quite mixed.
Because the children didn't yet know about the darker sides of life?
That was the ideal image, at least. Children knew neither sexual desire nor the meaning of death. Deceit, hypocrisy, lies, all that was foreign to them. Reality looked different, of course. Children experienced death early, and people certainly believed them capable of misbehavior.
And that surely led to...
And that led to very concrete practices. For example, there was the custom of having children walk at the front of the procession during religious festivals.
Oh, the most innocent ones leading the way.
Exactly. Direct evidence of separate children's processions is rare. Children appear in monastic sources mainly in school contexts. But the custom of the boy bishop is well documented, where a boy was dressed in bishop's regalia and led processions.
That's a lovely image. these little people as symbols of purity.
They were considered God-given gifts, not property of the parents in today's sense, but something entrusted to them.
That's an interesting distinction. Today we talk about my children, about parental rights. But this view, children as gifts from God that one must care for, there's something humble about it.
Though we have to be careful with generalizations. The Middle Ages span centuries across very different regions and cultures.
Exactly. That confirms what you said at the beginning. There simply was no the one childhood.
And that's exactly what makes the topic so fascinating. The closer you look, the more facets you discover, from education to work to play.
Let's look at why children were so important to medieval society in the first place. And I don't just mean the emotional level.
You mean the economic aspect?
Exactly. And as we hinted earlier, for peasants, it was a matter of sheer survival.
And for the nobility, as we discussed, it was about securing the dynasty.
Which called the entire succession into question.
A very uncertain foundation, considering the circumstances of the time.
It was a constant struggle against uncertainty, which of course also shaped how childhood itself was perceived.
What always amazes me is how age was categorized back then. Medieval society recognized 7 different life stages.
7 stages?
And the first stage, according to Isidore of Seville, the infantia, meaning what we would call early childhood, ended at age 7.
At 7 years old?
Yes. From then on began the second stage, the pueritia, boyhood, so to speak. That was considered complete at 14, and only then came adolescentia, actual youth.
That's such a fundamental difference from today. We speak of childhood until 10, 12, and adolescence lasts at least until 18. Some say even longer.
This medieval concept had massive consequences for everyday life. If you were no longer a child at 7,
then working was normal much earlier.
Many children started helping with work early on, varying by status and region, whether they wanted to or not.
And that affected mainly the lower social classes, both in the countryside and in the cities. The fields of work were varied, so there was of course agriculture, then mining,
domestic service, crafts, all sorts of things.
In mining, this is particularly well documented from the early modern period, from the 16th century onward. In the Harz and Ore mountains, children from about 8 or 9 helped with lighter tasks.
And precisely because they were small.
Their small size was you have to put this in quotation marks, an advantage. They could crawl into narrow tunnels where adults couldn't fit anymore. They hauled ore, pulled minecarts, did what was called sorting work, separating ore from waste rock.
Under conditions we can hardly imagine today. Dark, dusty, dangerous.
And in the countryside it wasn't necessarily easier. The little ones herded livestock, helped with the harvest, gathered firewood, whatever needed doing.
Although an important distinction must be made, there were free and unfree peasants. Those were completely different worlds.
And that made a difference for the children?
An enormous one. Unfree peasants were bound to their lord. Their children had to serve as maids and farmhands from very early on, often not even on their own farm, but directly for the lord.
Free peasants, on the other hand, who owned their own land, could achieve real prosperity. Their children had duties too, but under different conditions.
More self-determination, better nutrition, sometimes even the prospect of
education.
Speaking of education, that too depended entirely on social standing.
Wealthy families, whether nobility or prosperous burghers, could afford private tutoring at home. In the cities, there were at least elementary schools, and what surprised me, in some of them, boys and girls actually sat in the same room, though that was more pragmatic because there was only one teacher. The girls mainly learned to read, religious texts mostly. Writing was more for boys.
Co-education in the Middle Ages?
At least at that level. Interesting that it had such pragmatic reasons.
In the countryside, on the other hand,
there was often simply nothing, neither lessons nor school.
Children learned through work, through watching and participating, learning by doing, so to speak.
That also explains why the majority of the population were illiterate. Education was a privilege, not a right.
And even when schools existed, the priority was clearly on work. The family's economic survival always came first.
What a contrast to today. For us, it's the opposite. Compulsory education, prohibition of child labor. Children should learn, not work.
Although this development hasn't been around that long for us either. Universal compulsory education, labor protection for children, these are achievements of the last 200 years.
Sometimes you forget how short this phase of history actually is. For most of human history, child labor was the norm.
And in the Middle Ages, it was built into the social structure. The 7 age stages, the early work obligations, all part of a system designed for maximum use of all available hands. Let's look at what everyday interaction with children in the Middle Ages was like. And there's immediately a surprising parallel to modern recommendations.
You mean breastfeeding?
Children in the Middle Ages were breastfed for an average of at least 2 years. That's considerably longer than what's common today.
The WHO still recommends 2 years as a guideline today. But in practice, most mothers in Germany breastfeed for much shorter. 6 months, maybe a year.
In the Middle Ages, extended breastfeeding had another very practical reason. It probably also served as contraception.
That actually works, at least partially. Frequent breastfeeding suppresses ovulation.
But for noble women it was different. They often didn't have the time or desire to breastfeed for so long.
Because of social obligations?
Among other things, noble women very often entrusted their children to wet nurses. That way they could return more quickly to court life, festivities, political events, representation.
And it had another effect. Without constant breastfeeding, they became pregnant again more quickly.
Which was quite intentional. Especially if only girls had been born so far, the pressure was enormous to finally
produce a male heir, as harsh as that sounds.
That was the reality. The continuation of the dynasty depended on it.
So a very sober calculation behind the wet nurse system. Less outsourcing of care, more strategic family planning.
Now we come to a topic that seems alien to us today. Child-rearing methods.
You mean corporal punishment?
Physical violence was a common means of discipline in the Middle Ages. It wasn't the exception, but the rule. And there are literary sources that describe it very concretely.
Parenting guides, essentially, just from the 13th century.
Take Berthold of Regensburg, for example, a Franciscan friar. He, around the mid-13th century, at the height of his fame in the 1250s and 1260s, gave very specific instructions in his sermons.
What did he write?
He proclaimed, and I'm paraphrasing here, that from the moment a child speaks its first bad words, one should keep a little switch at the ready. It should always be within reach, stuck in the ceiling or the wall.
Always within reach.
And when the child shows bad behavior or speaks bad words, you should give it a stroke on the bare skin. But, and this is interesting, not hit the head with your hand.
Why not?
Because otherwise you might turn the child into a fool, according to the reasoning. Only the little switch, that it fears, and then it will be well raised.
That's so systematic. Almost a manual for corporal punishment.
Hard for us to imagine today, but we have to see it in context. The children knew nothing else. They probably perceived this behavior as completely normal.
That doesn't make it any better, of course, but...
And that's exactly why it persisted for so long. What isn't questioned doesn't get changed.
And yet, even back then, there was an awareness that children need more than just food and discipline.
That brings us to one of the most disturbing accounts from the Middle Ages. Emperor Frederick II's experiment.
That already sounds ominous.
Frederick II was Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, a man with great scientific interest. In the 13th century, according to the historical account, he had an experiment conducted.
What kind of experiment?
He wanted to find out what language children would speak if no one spoke to them. Hebrew? Greek? Latin? The language of Adam?
He wanted to find the original language.
And now, a quick word from our sponsor. Feeling curious? Then head over to battlemerchant.com. They've got all sorts of medieval stuff, from costumes to armor and loads more. Totally worth a look.
He ordered wet nurses to care for infants, but not to show them affection, not to speak to them, no tenderness, only meet their basic physical needs.
That's a terrible experiment.
And the result was?
They all died?
All the children died. Without attention, without human warmth, without being spoken to, they couldn't survive.
That's so devastating. But at the same time, it's shockingly early knowledge that children need emotional bonding.
We have to be careful. This story comes to us through the chronicler Salimbene of Parma, who was no friend of the emperor. The details aren't historically verified.
But even if it were exaggerated or invented, the fact that such a story was told and believed shows that people already knew back then children need more than just food.
The knowledge was there, that a child withers without attention. But the consequences weren't drawn from it, at least not across the board.
Attachment research in the 13th century, proven in the most terrible way.
You could put it that way. Modern developmental psychology only scientifically substantiated these findings in the 20th century, with the work of John Bowlby and attachment theory.
Centuries later, even though the knowledge was already there in a sense.
History doesn't repeat itself, but it often rhymes. And this dark episode shows that humans have always sensed what children really need, even if they didn't always act on it.
After all the heavy topics, now for something nicer. Children did play too, after all.
And how? The play instinct is simply universal. It can't be suppressed, no matter what era.
But of course, here too much depended on social standing. What toys a child had was directly dependent on which family they were born into.
What was the standard then?
Well, the basics, so to speak. Spinning tops, dolls, marbles, animal figures made of wood and clay. Almost any family could afford that, or make it themselves.
Wooden toys were practical. The father carved a spinning top, the mother sewed a rag doll from scraps.
Among wealthy families, of course, things looked completely different. There were painted ceramic birds, elaborately carved hobby horses, even wooden horses on wheels.
And musical instruments.
Flutes, tambourines, small drums. That was luxury toys.
That shows again this stark difference between the classes. While one child played with a hand-carved wooden horse, another had an elaborately painted hobby horse with a carved head.
But what really fascinates me, the games themselves were often the same. Rich or poor, all children played in the sand and dirt.
Building sandcastles?
Houses, walls, towers. Just like today. Some things simply don't change.
And then there were skill games. Headstands, cartwheels. That developed strength and coordination.
And hopscotch. The hopping game probably already existed in the Middle Ages.
Really?
Children scratched the playing field into the ground and then hopped, just like we did on the schoolyard.
That's somehow reassuring. To know that children played the same games 800 years ago.
Tag and chasing games were also very popular. Hide and seek. Role-playing games where children imitated adults. Throwing games with balls, coins, or rings.
And then there were the dice.
Those were often made of bone or wood.
Dice games were incredibly popular, among children and adults alike.
The practical thing was, even the poorest families could afford dice. You took a bone from dinner and carved it into shape. Done.
That's truly democratic toys. No expensive materials, no elaborate production. A knife, a bone, and the game can begin.
Among adults, of course, they also gambled for money. That was a real problem. Gambling addiction existed in the Middle Ages too.
Were children kept away from that?
Probably not always. The boundaries between children's play and adult entertainment were more fluid than today.
Which brings me to the topic of playtime. Children from poorer families hardly had any time left to play after work.
Except in winter. In the countryside, there was less to do during the cold months. The days grew shorter, fieldwork rested.
So, more time for family.
And for playing. The children could finally relax. Those with many siblings had enough playmates right there.
That's a nice detail. Winter as a breathing space in the hard daily grind.
Although that too depended on status. Noble children had time to play all year round. For them, winter was simply winter.
While for peasant children, the seasons determined the rhythm. Summer, work. Winter, finally a chance to catch your breath.
I sometimes wonder if the games were also intended to be educational.
Partly, surely. Role-playing games where children imitated craftsmen or knights. That was also preparation for later life.
Learning by playing.
Learning through imitation. That's still a basic principle today.
Some things just never change. Children play, they imitate, they learn. Whether in the Middle Ages or today.
And they need that time. Even when daily life was hard, they still played. We've already seen that. The play instinct is universal. To close, let's look at something that's often overlooked. Children's clothing.
That wasn't so different from today, was it?
Actually, children's clothing in the Middle Ages hardly differed from adult garments. The same cuts, the same materials, the same colors, just smaller.
That actually makes sense. Special children's fashion as its own category? That's a relatively modern concept.
Among the lower classes, mothers made the clothing themselves. Flax, linen, wool, whatever was available.
And the cut was deliberately kept wide and comfortable. Children had to be able to move, to work.
Boys from simple backgrounds wore plain tunics and loose trousers. For girls, it was an undergarment, an overdress over that, plus a coif or a kerchief.
Both boys and girls had leather turn shoes, and depending on the occupation, an apron was added.
What I particularly like, the clothing was often intentionally made too large.
So the children could grow into it?
Children literally grew into their clothing. Too big at first, Then, after a few years, it fit.
Parents today do the same thing. Buy a size larger so it lasts longer.
That really is a
Universal parenting principle. Like with the games. Some things never change.
And when a child outgrew the clothing, it was passed on to the next sibling. Inherited, patched, worn on.
In poorer families, every piece of clothing was used until it really fell apart.
Among the upper classes, things looked different. Although, in the early Middle Ages, the differences weren't that great yet.
Only later?
From the High Middle Ages onward, the nobility began to distinguish themselves through more opulent cuts. They simply required more fabric. That alone made them unaffordable for ordinary people.
On top of that came embroidery and trimmings. Children's clothing of the upper class was every bit as splendid as that of adults.
While the majority of the population could never have afforded such decorations.
That runs through everything we've discussed today.
Social standing determined so much. Toys, education, workload, and also clothing.
But there were also these universal moments.
Children playing in the sand, parents getting clothes a size bigger, siblings as playmates.
And the realization that children need affection, as tragically as that was discovered.
It was a world of stark contrasts.
But it was also a time when children played, when families stuck together, when children, despite everything, were allowed to be children, at least sometimes.
And that's what makes this era so human, I'd say. Not just foreign and dark, but also familiar.
I think that's a lovely thought to end on.
And that brings us to the end of this episode. If this topic interested you, at battlemerchant.com you'll find many more articles on medieval history and everyday culture in the blog.
And of course the right gear if you want to immerse yourself in this era, whether for reenactment, LARP, or at the next medieval fair.
Thanks for listening.
Until next time.
And so we ride towards the end of this episode. Keep your sword sharp and your mugs full. We'll catch you in the next one.